Good afternoon, dear listeners. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Elena Gromberg, and I will guide you today through our webinar. I have to inform you that the webinar is being recorded and will be later available on the Platomics official page. We are very happy to see so much interest to our webinar. We have almost 200 listeners from different countries, and we know that almost 1/3 of them already pre-registered for our GSPR Assistant, which shows a significant need of support in this area, which we are happy to provide. It's also important to mention that our target auditorium are diagnostic quality managers, regulatory affairs managers, specialists in assay development and validation, and of course, the management of diagnostic laboratories. The goal of this webinar is to help diagnostic laboratories to better understand how the in-house tests, also called laboratory developed tests, will be regulated under IVDR, how to correctly interpret these new regulations, and how to apply them in practice. We will also present our digital tool that will help laboratories to comply with this new requirement. Down below, you can find the button Q&A, and we encourage you to type your questions in this Q&A section. We will address them to our speakers in the end of our webinar. And the next presenter is Dr. Sebastian Grömminger from Jona Institute, an expert in MDR and IVDR. And please, the stage is yours now.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Platomics team for organizing this webinar and you, Elena, for introducing me. It's a pleasure for me to talk about the lab-developed tests under the IVDR and what the effects are of that new progressive rollout for the medical laboratories. I don't want to repeat all of that what Karina Hellbert already said, so there are a few redundancies, but I'd like to add some more value to it with demonstrating what you could do next to perform with to comply with these requirements. So I am from profession a molecular biologist, have some years experience with ISO 13485 and software development, and since July 2017 I am consultant at Jona Institute, and I'm responsible with a team here at Jona Institute for the in-vitro diagnostic medical device regulation and its application for manufacturers and for laboratories. So who do we want to target in this webinar? First of all, the laboratory quality managers, which are possibly responsible for complying with the regulations. But somehow we suspect that there will be a future role in the laboratories, which we may call as well regulatory affairs managers, as compared to manufacturers, where this role is usually implemented since years. Business developer, who are, so to say, responsible for the service portfolio management in the laboratory, and the specialists in assay development and performance evaluation are targeted as well, and for sure the management of medical laboratories. So if we compare a CE-IVD device from a manufacturer in a regular use with an in-house developed product, a lab developed test, then the scenario looks as follows. The manufacturer of an IVD product produces under its quality management system a CE-IVD product and provides it to the laboratories, and they put this CE-IVD product into service. And then if a patient comes to the physician and gets consulted by the physician, the result may be that the physician recommends a sample to be taken and to be examined in the laboratory. So the sample is sent to the laboratory, and the laboratory does the examination with the CE-IVD product, and the result is sent back to the physician, and the physician treats the patient or recommends something to the patient. And if we compare this to the lab developed test scenario, we may have a research use only product that is provided by a research manufacturer. And then some parts of development and production take place to a certain extent within the medical laboratory. And then this procedure, this developed procedure is implemented as a laboratory developed test into the procedure. And this is also a putting into service. And the same scenario takes place as the patient comes to the physician. So there is no change at all for the patient and for the physician. They may not even see that this is a lab developed test, may not even recognize the difference here. And this is a circumstance that the EU wanted to regulate, or to so to say compare with each other and bring it onto a comparable level of control. And what we suggest here, or what we estimate, is that a medical laboratory is so to say equal to a health institution. And Karina Hellbert already told you what a health institution is. Just for repetition, it means an organization, the primary purpose of which is the care or treatment of patients or the promotion of public health. So more than 50% should be in this regard, and I see a medical laboratory operating under the care of patients and somehow promoting public health by letting the public know whether, so to say, a test positivity rate is high or low as compared to the COVID-19 situation we all have learned in the past 2 years. But what we need to look at is from A to Z. We're starting from the situation where the patient comes into play, and there the physician is responsible for selecting the right patient population, looking at the indication whether this fits to the intended purpose, and that the specimen collection is performed correctly, and then handing it over to the speditor, where the responsibility is in his or her hands to make sure that the transport is performed correctly and the storage conditions are met. And then it's handed over to lab technicians, and they are responsible for the preparation, pre-analytics, quality control, and analytics in the medical laboratory. And the data is then handed over to a clinical expert doing the analysis, or managing the analysis and performing the reporting of the results. And the results are then sent back to the physician and the patient. But what's now important is to understand that this is a procedure where a lot of products are placed into that procedure. So we may have product A, which is a specimen collection set. Product B may be an extraction kit. Product C may be an assay for the performing a certain analysis. And the analyzers, the instrument where these assays are say run, and product E may be an interpretation software that helps to understand what these data mean for the single patient and provide the benefit to the patient with the correct interpretation. So, and a medical laboratory becomes a manufacturer, or so to say, takes over the responsibility of a manufacturer of an LDT if it uses proprietary products or processes, if it uses non-IVD products in the diagnostic process, for example, for research use only products, if it combines products or processes that are not intended for this combination outlined in the IFU of the manufacturer, if it uses CE IVD products outside of the intended purpose, which we call off-label use, against or beyond the instructions for use, or if it modifies the product, including also deviations from these instructions for use of the IVD manufacturer. So these are the circumstances where a medical laboratory becomes or is responsible equal to a manufacturer. So let us look into the IVDR transition timeline. The IVDR came into force in May 2017. We now approach May 2022, very soon, when the IVDR will become valid. And usually, or originally the in vitro diagnostic medical device directive, so the old law, should have become invalid on the 26th of May 2025. However, with the new amending regulation that was set into force on the 25th of January this year, this date moves back or into a later year, the year 2028. And this is due to the fact that the transitional periods for CE IVD products are as well longer. And you see the longest period is for class B and A sterile, which are allowed to place the products onto the market for additional 5 years, including the sales phase. So this is the latest time point, and as Karina Hellbert already said, it's necessary that laboratories can compare the devices to their own LDTs to the devices on the market, and therefore this is a relevant time point that influences the timeline for lab-developed tests as well. What are now the transitional periods for lab-developed tests? You see, from 26th of May this year, the laboratory-developed tests must comply with the IVDR Annex I with the general safety and performance requirements. No transfer is allowed, as Karina Hellbert already told. They need to perform vigilance activities, so reporting to the authorities in case of incidences. And it's limited to less than industrial scale, so it must not be an industrial scale level of production, so to say, of the products that are developed in-house. And some of the requirements that are outlined in Article 5.5 are postponed to for 2 years until 2024, and the respective one, which is the comparison to the other products on the market, is postponed until 2028. Let's come into a few more details very soon. What we find in general in Article 5 is a device may be put into service only if it complies with this regulation. So by complying with Article 5, these products should be complying with this regulation. And the general safety and performance requirements need to be met. And this includes also performance evaluation, which is very often overseen. Devices that are manufactured and used within health institutions are considered as being put into service. And then there's an exception. So except Annex I, the requirements of this regulation shall not apply to devices manufactured and used in-house. And these are the 9 relevant points of Article 5.5. We have demonstrated this in earlier webinars as well. But what I wanted to show with this slide is what are the respective postponements. So you see, with the amending regulation, no transfer is allowed. This is directly applicable from 26th of May this year. So as Karina Hellbert said, this is very critical and is put under sue if you do not comply with that. A proper QMS required is postponed. Laboratories must comply with ISO 15189, or the national accreditation solution is as well postponed. Providing information to the authorities and publishing a name and identification of the products and declare conformity is also postponed, as well as setting up a so-called lab-developed test file is postponed, and the respective production according to this documentation is then also postponed, as well as the so to say post-market surveillance for lab-developed tests. That you see left over is the comparison to the competitor IVDs on the market, which is then applicable in 2028. So what should be your next activities? You should declare your laboratory as a health institution in your quality manual, for example. Now, it's very necessary that you do that as soon as possible. You should fill out and sign an Annex I checklist. And this should be done until May this year. You should complete a lab-developed test file and upgrade your quality management system until the 26th of May 2024, so in 2 years, until 2 years. And you should discard your lab developed tests with equal CE IVD products on the market, or perform the respective conformity assessment so that they become a CE IVD product according to the IVDR. And this should be done until 2028. Yeah, and then you start monitoring the competitor CE IVD products and reach full compliance with IVDR. This is then ongoing from 2028 on. And yeah, how do you prove the conformity based? Usually this is based on a checklist. So you list in the checklist all the requirements of Annex I. You judge whether this is applicable or not, the respective requirement, and choose a method if yes, or give a justification if no. And you should document or provide a document and ID and a reference where we find this evidence that you have fulfilled this requirement, in the case that this is regarded as applicable. And yeah, this is, so to say, the basis of such a GSPR tool that Platomics is going to present later. And with this, I would like to close my talk and would like to thank you for listening. This could also be relevant for you. We have a seminar for IVDR for medical laboratories. So please visit our website if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Grömminger, for a very informative talk and for a stepwise instructions of how to document LDT. And now we are coming to our last presenter, my colleague in Platomics, Andreas Oberleitner, who will go deeper into the topic of GSPR assessment and present us a GSPR assistant.
Thank you very much, Elena, for the introduction, and I wish you all a nice afternoon. So I would now like to take a closer look at the implementation, try to bridge the gap again. And of course, in the course of this introduction, I would also like to show you our latest release, the PlatoX GSPR Assistant for our digitalized support. Briefly about me, I have a background in biomedical engineering, and at Platomics, I'm responsible for the quality management and the regulatory affairs. We at Platomics, we work on a diagnostic software products for genetic testing, and in addition, we provide also software developments and services in the area of IVD regulation and compliance. So we have already heard from Sebastian and Karina that the IVDR also puts requirements on health institutions that manufacture in-house devices. But how do the laboratories, for example, see this? What is their level of awareness, their perception there? Well, a look at recently published literature shows that the requirements are definitely perceived as critical and challenging. On the other hand, we must state that many requirements in detail are not really new, but in any case, we know that the requirements now are defined via a European regulation, which is the IVDR. We have also already learned about the timeline. We know that compliance with the GSPRs will be required as early as May 22 for all LDTs used for diagnostic purposes. On the other hand, due to this progressive rollout mentioned before, the usage of LDTs will also be possible until at least 28, even in those cases where there are comparable CE products on the market. To highlight once again, 4 important key points about the GSPRs from the point of view of laboratories. First, we know that GSPRs are also to be fulfilled by health institutions with their LDTs. Secondly, if we take a closer look at these requirements given in Annex I, we find that this annex contains 20 main requirements with about 60 sub-requirements. Depending on how you look at it, these can be broken down into over 190 individual questions. So the effort here is definitely not to be underestimated. Thirdly, the national authorities are obliged to check and monitor compliance with the requirements in the respective member states. So in addition, the accreditation bodies, in the case of corresponding accreditations, will also have a look at the compliance of these tests in future. And last but not least, We also know that in less than 3 months, it will be the time. So it must also once again repeat here that it really affects all the LDTs in use, including established ones. So there is definitely no grandfathering principle on that. Well, from the larger number of discussions with affected stakeholders, we have already established that there are many questions, ambiguities. Some examples we frequently heard of are, for example, what are these GSPRs? Where do I find them? What is my device under assessment exactly? I have workflows with multiple devices. How can I assess them? I want to do it in some kind of structured way, and so on and so forth. So a lot of different questions. These questions are, of course, very practically oriented issues, and unfortunately, there is still a lack of corresponding official guidelines on many of these questions up to now. So from Sebastian and Karina's presentations, we have already learned what Annex I and the GSPRs are all about. The GSPR checklist here plays a special role, as we have already heard. This will also be discussed in the following. I would like to put in the context of the IVDR with a laboratory environment. On the other hand, we have the regulatory framework here with the IVDR in the GSPRs itself. This is the regular basis, the regulatory framework we have to consider here. On the other hand, we have a health institution or a lab with its implemented QM system, obviously also with some accreditations, introduced already some verification documents for the different tests. So first of all, it will be definitely necessary to assess all of these GSPRs given in Annex I and to check if they apply on your devices or not. Secondly, you definitely need to set up these GSPR checklists. These lists plays really a major role. It comes into play and should document exactly the connection from your documentation to the fulfillment of the GSPRs, including the statements of your assessment. So in most cases, a verification document is required that shows that the requirement of the respective GSPRs are definitely fulfilled. I already gave some examples like verification reports, validation documents, maybe a risk management file, and so on. If such an evidence is missing, we speak of a gap in the GSPR evidence. This picture also shows that you can use standards or different guidelines to show how you fulfill the GSPRs themselves and also to come up for the relevant evidence. So let's summarize again. So within this framework of our GSPR project, we need a detailed assessment of the applicability of each of these GSPRs. We need also to determine how we want to fulfill these GSPRs, for example, through appropriate standards, and we also need to document this whole thing. Implicitly, we also see that within this framework, we need to conduct a gap analysis and also an action plan to close these gaps. And since such a project cannot be completed in a few minutes, an overview in terms of project management would also not be bad either. In order to be able to support laboratories and manufacturers in these activities in a targeted manner, we at Platomics have decided to build a tool for this purpose. This is the PlatoX GSPR Assistant. So this GSPR Assistant is primarily used to create the required checklist for a specific device under assessment, here marked in blue. It enables digital processing and storage from the assessment to the gap analysis. The process is supplemented by a variety of additional information. For progress analysis, the tool also comes with a simple status and the report functionality we will see then later. I now, in the following, would like to present the GSPR Assistant. This is directly in our tool. Probably due to the situation that we have now presentation in Zoom, it might be
we can see it, Andreas,
for you, but it should be recognizable. So in the beginning, we see a screen including a list of our projects. Each of these projects has the intention to be used for one single assessment of your device or workflow. As you can see here, we have already two lines which represent two projects here. I will now enter one of these projects we already prepared for the presentation. First of all, you need to fill out some project information, some basic information. Mainly, this is information that is required to collect information on your institution or company, like name, address, and such things, but also details on the quality management itself. For example, the compliance and fulfillment of some standards. As you might see here, this is already pre-filled for this example. On the right side, we provide you with a lot of information to help you to fill these questions out. So as you can see, for each of those questions, you will find some examples, some additional information text that should support you in using the tool itself and filling it out. In the second section, you need to describe your device a little bit more. So first of all, what is the type of device? As we learned, we need to fill it out being as a health institution for the in-house manufactured devices, but this could also be the case for a typical legal manufacturer for their products, for example. Very important, you need to state if your device is used for diagnostic purposes, since the IVDR is only applicable to such devices. You need to provide a little bit about your intended purpose and also a short description of the test, but this is more for documentation issues. If you're done with this, you can directly continue to the GSPR questionnaire itself. What you can see here is on the left side a tree of all of these broken down GSPRs, the single requirements. You can navigate through them freely. And you see also already a lot of different symbols which indicate the status of them. So for example, if I would now switch to one of these GSPRs, you find the information on the GSPR itself in this middle section here. So you can read through that and you can then decide on the applicability. As we learned from the previous speakers, you need to answer some questions regarding the applicability for each of those GSPRs. You need to justify if and why this requirement is applicable or why not. And then you also need to indicate which methods or what your way was, how to fulfill each of these GSPRs, if it is applicable. And last but not least, you could also come up with some applied standards and solutions. As we learned, application of standards is always the golden way to provide the proof of evidence. And last but not least, of course, you also need to link to your documents. Typically, just mentioning the documents for this checklist here is absolutely fine. I will now give you one small example. For example, the chapter 3 deals with risk management. In the sub GSPR 3A, the requirement wants us to establish and document a risk management plan for each device. So first of all, we need to decide if this requirement is applicable. On the right side, you additionally see a lot of additional information. For example, some guidance questions. These guidance questions should guide you through the process and should definitely help you in filling out and coming to the decision at the end. So for example, we already stated that our device is a medically purpose device. So that means that the chance is really high that this single requirement is applicable. So I will select yes for this one. Furthermore, the system needs to get some more information, for example, on the justification for the application. I need to state why this device or why this GSPR is applicable to my device. So I prepared already a text to save some time. I will just copy paste it here, but to give you an example, I could, for example, state that this device is an in-house manufactured product, an LDT, intended to be used for a medical purpose. Then I need to come up with some methods to describe shortly how we want to approach the fulfillment, since it is applicable. And for example, for this specific GSPR, we could state, I will make it a little bit larger, that we created and released a risk management plan accordingly to the relevant standards, including a description of the examinations and services, including assignment of responsibilities and authorities, and so on and so forth. Of course, as already mentioned, a standard would help us. For that purpose, I will show you another cool feature of our tool. You can switch to the Standards tab. And for each and every of the GSPRs, we now here find a list of specific standards which are suitable or should be suitable to this individual particular GSPR. So for example, I see that there is the ISO 22367 standard, which deals with application of risk management to medical laboratories. This is something that definitely would be applied very commonly. So in our example, I would just say that we are fulfilling this standard, and I will use the standard for my evidence. And last but not least, of course, I need to link to a certain document that proves everything. In our example here, I just put a name of a document, the risk management plan, in a certain version and a certain release date to come up with the relevant link. Last but not least, of course, we also want to see how progress is. As already mentioned, you see it in the symbols on the left side. But the system also provides you with a full gap assessment on all of these GSPRs. That means for each of these GSPRs, the symbols indicate where some information is still missing, where you have already filled out something, and how your decision was in the beginning. So having a look on this list immediately leads you to the open gaps. So the tool, of course, has the intended purpose itself to provide you with the final report. The report is something that you definitely want to use for your own documentation. This can be done by a simple click. With this preview report, you now see that something happened in the background, and we received a draft document that contains all the information that is given and is already known within the system, starting with some general information. It's already formatted completely. And then this document sums up the whole GSPR list as a checklist, including all of the content here. So this document definitely can be used as soon as it is completed for your documentation within the lab developed test file. And we'll now also talk a little bit about already some additional features. So as already mentioned, in the course of development, we have established this partnership with the Institut. This allows us to provide really regulatory content of very high quality. So our goal was definitely to make the tool quickly available to the labs right now. It is published, it is released and available, but this was just the beginning. So we are already planning on follow-up versions as well. A small preview of what you can expect, among other things, is a German language package will be available soon. The provision of templates to create LDT files beyond the checklist we have seen before. Improvement of workflow and user experience, and even more tailoring towards the health institutions and LDTs. But also to direct you or give you access to expert consulting together with the Institute directly over the tool. And yeah, many more. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to write to the given email address. Okay, last but not least, in the course of this development, we established this partnership, and we will continue on developing. But I think Elena will tell you a little bit more about this after my talk. For now, I thank you very much for your attendance, and yeah, I'm happy to answer your questions afterwards.
And now I would like to welcome our first presenter, Dr. Karina Hellbert from MBH Law firm, an expert in the healthcare and pharmaceutical legal matters with 10-minute talk about the legal interpretation of IVDR connected to laboratories.
Welcome to the webinar. My name is Karina Hellbert. As Elena was so kind to already introduce me, I'm working in my own law firm with 2 other lawyers, being specialized in the pharmaceutical medical devices field. Elena already explained the term in-house test. Why is it relevant? Because the different names do not really guide you through the legal document, because the European Union uses a little bit of a different term as the FDA would do. So if you look up in the European legislation, you need to use the term in-house test or in-house testing. Can I have the next slide, please? The famous Article 5. What is of relevance? The relevant part are already in red here, meaning that from the 26th of May 2022, the legal red highlighted parts will enter into force, be implemented at laboratory level. What does it mean? We have 3 relevant terms here, with the exception of the relevant general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex I, the so-called GSPR requirements in Annex I. Then we have the term health institution, which is not red. And we have that the devices are not transferred to another legal entity. These 3 requirements, meaning you have to be a health institution, meaning you have to comply with the general safety and performance requirements, and you're not entitled to transfer your in-house tests to another legal entity, will apply from May 2022 on. The next slide, please. Now, what was the reason why the other provisions were deferred with respect to the implementation at the hospital level? The simple fact was that the hospitals were confronted with the COVID-19 crisis, with the COVID-19 pandemic. The resources were tightened up with fighting this pandemic situation. And that's the reason why the European Commission considered it appropriate to defer all other provisions except the 3 provisions I mentioned before. And also, with respect to in-house tests, you know that you can only further on use such in-house tests if another commercial product is not available. But then you have to make market research. And that's the reason why you have to identify the target patient groups needs. And this considered the European Commission as already in 2022, this should be achieved. So what is the first relevant term? The next slide, please. Health institution. So not every institution is a health institution, which makes sense. But of course, you have to be careful whether you are indeed a health institution. Your primary purpose must relate to care, treatment of patients, or promotion of public health. Not covered will be only institutions pursuing health interests, such as gyms, spas, etc. And there we have a little bit of an issue with scientific research institutions. They are making basic research. Is the basic research related to care treatment of patients? Normally not, because it is basic research. Is it related to promotion of public health? It depends a little bit on how you define basic research, what kind of funding you have, what are your projects, but at least you have to think about it, whether your institution, if you still would like to rely on in-house tests, are indeed public health institution. And you have to document it, because the authorities will indeed look in your documentation whether you will be a health institution or not, or only simply research institutions, which would not be sufficient under the IVDR to still make some in-house tests. The next slide, please. Now, for knowing that, you have to look a little bit be of a detective to know the legal structure of your hospital situation or the situation in the regions is. Because another legal entity could be something like your hospital in the next city, could be a sister hospital which you are cooperating. And there is one specific problem with the outsourced lab. Some hospitals have outsourced the lab activities, even to a lab being inside the hospital premises. But this is still outside another legal entity. So it could simply be the fact how the outsourced lab is invoicing you, but respectively whether the outsourced lab is correctly invoicing some other entity, whether it's only invoicing, let's say, the result, negative, positive within the range, or whether it's really invoicing something like in-house test performed by. And there are already the differences from a legal perspective, whether it is an in-house test within the same legal entity or with another legal entity. And then you have to be careful not to go into this kind of trap by simply not making the invoice in a correct way. The next slide, please. Relevant general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex I. Here we have to decide a little bit. This is a hardcore provision. You have to comply with the relevant general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex I. So there is the legal obligation on you, on the lab. It's the same thing as the legal obligation is on the medical device manufacturers, the IVD manufacturers, that they normally have to put the CE marking on the product. The judge can simply decide, is the CE marking there or not, and whether the exemptions are given that no CE marking must be given. But that's the only discretion the judge has. So the IVDR, the Medical Devices Act 2021, are the hardcore facts. As well, the administrative penal code, it's the rule in Austria and more or less also in Germany, stating how you will face criminal, respectively administrative fines, the Product Liability Act, where you have a defective product, and sometimes also the Trade Act, because if you are not allowed to transfer the product to another legal entity, you normally don't need a Trade Act license. If you transfer a product to another legal entity, you need a Trade Act license. And then there are guidance documents. Here the judge is a little bit definitely more flexible. You have to achieve the relevant general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex I. But how you achieve it, here the judge has a discretion to decide whether you were on the correct path or not on the correct path. What will the judge normally take into account? Guidance by the Medical Device Coordination Group, standards being available on the market, and he will then, based on your input and based on your brief and based on your explanation, consider whether your own chosen path lead actually that you meet general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex I. With CE marking, he has no discretion. With the guidance documents the judge uses, and you provide him, he has a discretion whether he takes it into account or whether he doesn't take it into account. So it's a little bit more of how convincing your arguments are from a legal perspective, whether you comply with this requirement or not. Then the next slide, please. If you do not comply, it's simply stated in the law. In the Medical Devices Act of Austria, it simply says if you put a product on the market or IVD on the market, which is put on the market contrary to the requirements of the IVDR, you can face up to 25,000 euros, or in case of repetition, up to 50,000 euros. So transferring it to another legal entity, it's prohibited. Not comply with the GDPR is prohibited, and the fine is up to 25,000. Contractual liability, if you're working in a hospital lab and then the patient has a contract with you, respectively with the hospital. Also from that perspective, if the IVDR does not comply with the safety requirements, there is a contractual liability. The next slide, please. Product liability, it's always also hospital, even if they brew their own substances or their own compounds, they still falls under the product liability, and it's a liability without fault. It is simply a fact whether the product is considered defective or not defective, but this is more or less an issue between the patient and the operator of the hospital. Commercial liability, scrutiny of commercial manufacturers. If a lab is not entitled to transfer it to another legal entity and a commercial manufacturer becomes aware of it, that the lab is indeed transferring it to another legal entity, we have a breach of the law. The breach of the IVDR means under the trade-off against unfair trade practices, the competitor can sue you. Criminal liability is normally not really an issue, but it's more or less the only liability where the physician or where the lab person can still face its own liability, and he will be before the court and normally not the operator of the hospital. So that would be more or less the liability which knocks on the door if you don't comply either with not transferring it to another legal entity or not complying with the safety requirements as imposed by Annex I.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hellbert, for your outstanding insights. And before we move to the question and answer part of our webinar, I want to emphasize that our GSPR Assistant is provided free of charge for laboratories and healthcare institutions. For those institutions who don't fall under this category, we are developing a different portal, which is specially tailored for IVD manufacturers from industry. So stay in touch, sign up for our newsletters on the Platomics webpage. And for the users of the GSPR Assistant, so the healthcare institutions, we are also providing free of charge support and training in form of a workshop with best practice LDT examples. Some of you already pre-registered for GSPR Assistant, and we will get in contact with you regarding the further organizational details of these workshops. And those who didn't register, you have this chance now. You can find in the Zoom chat a link to the questionnaire where you can leave your contact information and register for the GSPR Assistant, so you will get a workshop and access to this assistant. That's all information for now, and we are moving to our questions. And the first question that we selected is it possible to fill in the information in German language? I guess it's a question to Andreas.
Yes, it is. Technically speaking, you can fill out your information in every language. The issue here is that the final GSPR report, of course, however, will be then a mixture of the English template texts and your provided German texts. But as mentioned, we are working on the German version as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question, can I use the report for audits and accreditations?
Again, that's for me, I guess. So yes, you can. The idea of the report is to be ready for use as a key element within your technical documentation. The only thing you have to consider is that, of course, you need to handle this document according to your own document control procedures afterwards. That means, for example, regarding your defined document storage process or review and release procedures. You have to store it, to sign it, and so on.
May I add to that, Elena?
Sure.
It is what the, so it's exactly what the authorities would expect from your side. So if we compare this to the compliance of IVD manufacturers, it is pretty much the same, what is very common in technical documentation, such a checklist. And the result of the GSPR tool is, so to say, the same as filling out a GSPR checklist. So this is essentially what the authorities would require. But for accreditation, I don't think that this is that much relevant, but we will see what the accreditation institutions will, whether they will pick this up and use this for the audits as well.
Thank you. The next question, will medical laboratories be required to provide LDT safety documentation, Annex I IVDR, as of May 2022, or does the extension also apply to this documentation?
So I can answer this question. If extension is equal here to longer transitional periods, I guess. So I would clearly state the Annex I of IVDR has to be fulfilled by the medical laboratories who have lab developed tests by May this year. So this is very urgent. And therefore, so the general safety and performance requirements outlined in Annex I must be fulfilled, or there must be at least a demonstration that your documentation is fulfilling each of these single requirements, including the safety requirements, because there are different requirements. Some are associated to safety, some are associated to performance, some are associated to labeling, so on and so forth.
Thank you. The next question, I guess, to Dr. Hellbert, who is now liable for compliance with the new requirements?
Okay. Who is liable with the requirements? It depends a little bit about your contract, because the contract can foresee that the head of the laboratory is liable, or the contract can foresee also for administrative purposes liable. That would be then binding for the administrative authorities, or the contract foresees the simple liability rule, and this is normally the general manager of the hospital who is the legally authorized representative of the hospital. So as stated, it depends a little bit of the contract that you have signed.
Thank you. The next question, for off-label use of CE certified tests, what could be the GSPR?
I think I can answer this question as well.
Yes, please.
I mean, that's very difficult. You may remember the slide I demonstrated with the procedure and the respective products inside the procedure. So it always depends on what part of the IFU was changed. So if a performance aspect was changed, so to say, an analytical performance aspect was changed, then the respective analytical performance requirements outlined in Annex I in Chapter 2 must be demonstrated by the laboratory in a verification and validation report. If, for instance, the diagnostic sensitivity or diagnostic specificity is changed, or the patient population is changed, then this affects the clinical performance evaluation, and new clinical data must be provided by the laboratory. So you see, I cannot answer this question just simply by yes or no. It very much depends on what you are deviating from the respective IFU of the CE IVD manufacturer.
Thank you. One more question. Are published verification data accepted, or in-house validation is a must? Where can I get the GSPR checklist?
So the GSPR checklist is essentially the same as the GSPR tool that Andreas has demonstrated is providing. We at your institute, we work with such checklists such as content of the consultation. But it's difficult for unexperienced roles to fill out these checklists. So therefore, this was the reason why we contributed to that development of the GSPR tool, to provide you with more detailed examples, what should be described, what level of depth into such a checklist, so that the GSPR tool in the end is a guidance or guides you to fill out the respective GSPR Annex I checklist. And that is, so to say, the goal of that tool.
Okay, unfortunately, thank you very much. And now we are running out of time and we have to finish our webinar. We still have several questions. We will provide answers to them in a written form. They will be emailed to the webinar attendees. I want to thank once again our speakers, also our auditorium for being so active in the question part of the webinar. And we are looking forward to seeing you again in our next webinars, our workshops. And I wish you a nice day. Thank you very much and bye-bye.